In his book, The Revolt of the Public, Martin Gurri argues that there are two major kinds of political groups: centers and borders. Centers stand for the establishment, the traditional elites. This includes almost all hierarchical institutions like corporations and governments. In contrast, the border is a group of ordinary people connected by some shared interest. This could take the form of a protest movement or an online community like a subreddit. Essentially, the center represents the insiders. The border represents the outsiders. Gurri says that the conflict between the center and the border has played a bigger and bigger role in politics over the last decade, and is likely to continue to do so. 2011 was an inflection point, with several democratic and not so democratic uprisings all around the world. From anti-government protests in Spain, Israel, and Russia, to the Arab Spring in the Middle East. In the United States, this took the form of Occupy Wall Street and the Tea Party movement.
We're thinking of having a Chicago Tea Party in July.
Even today, network groups continue to have a big impact on the world. So why are these clashes happening, and why does it matter? Gurri says that this is mostly the result of the changes in media technology which took place around the start of the 21st century. Basically, technology like the internet and smartphones allowed huge numbers of ordinary people to communicate with the world and with each other. As a result, people have been able to organize themselves in networks. That is, groups united by a shared goal or interest. These groups have strength in numbers and pose a challenge to the existing hierarchies and centers of power. These new technologies also mean that the public has greater access to information than ever before. In the past, people got most of their information from newspapers and governments. The centers essentially had a semi-monopoly on knowledge. This gave these institutions a lot of power to control the public discourse. Now, governments and legacy media are losing this power, and with it, a lot of their legitimacy in the eyes of the public. The issue now is that people have access to too much information, leading to confusion and uncertainty. This wouldn't be the first time that a change in information technology has caused big social transformations. Gurri says that the boom in digital media is actually the fifth such wave in history. The other four waves were 1. The invention of writing, 2. The creation of the alphabet, 3. The printing press, and 4. The rise of mass media in the 19th and 20th centuries. Events like the disastrous invasion of Iraq and the 2008 financial crash added to the public's distrust of the so-called experts and the people in power, at least in the West.
What in the world is happening on Wall Street?
And while 2011 was the big year where the border exploded onto the scene, Gurri says that the first mobilization of the border actually took place in 2008 with the election of Barack Obama.
Change has come to America.
Obama was the first to use a crowdsourced campaign which managed to raise huge amounts of money. His campaign also created a successful online network which they used not just to raise funds, but to organize volunteers and spread their message. In 2008, Obama also campaigned as a champion of the border. He portrayed himself as an outsider. In many of his speeches, he condemned both the Republican and the Democratic establishments.
While I was working on those streets, watching those folks see their jobs shipped overseas, you were a corporate lawyer sitting on the board of Walmart.
Once Obama was inside the White House, he faced a new challenge: how to govern as an outsider when you are now in power. A puzzle which arguably he never quite resolved. 8 years later, the 2016 US presidential election would also be won by a candidate who claimed to be an outsider who spoke for the border, although in a very different way. The election of Joe Biden, a veteran Washington insider, arguably represents the return to power of the center, at least in the USA and at least for now. So what does this all mean for the future? Firstly, traditional centers will have to adjust. The flow of information has changed forever, and the distance between the elites and the public has shrunk. Governments will either adapt to this or face endless challenges to their legitimacy. But the border will also have to be aware of the limits of what networks alone can achieve. Networks seem to be good at criticizing the centers of power, whether those are institutions, ideas, or as with cancel culture, even people. But these networks seldomly offer realistic alternatives to the status quo. The 2011 uprisings demonstrate the limits of what network groups can achieve. With the exception of Tunisia, the democratic movements during the Arab Spring failed to actually bring democracy to those countries. And even when networks are victorious, they find it difficult to effectively govern. In other words, it's hard for the border to become the center, as Obama learned the hard way.
Oops.
The takeaway from all this is that the tension between the old centers of power and the new networked groups is likely to continue to be a big factor in politics worldwide. Governments may collapse or not, different networked groups will come and go, but the conflict between center and border is here to stay.